us. We're going to let folks trickle in and we'll get started in a few seconds. Okay, folks, thank you so much for joining us and spending some of your evening with us. My name is Tracy Quarter, she, her, and I work at Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE. And we are here to talk about This is What Democracy Looks Like, a teach-in on participatory democracy by the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. Next slide. So right now, for our agenda, we're gonna have our welcome. We're gonna talk about who we are. We're gonna do a group decision-making exercise. We're gonna talk about the scope and possibility of participatory democracy. We're gonna have an amazing panel discussion. I don't think y'all are ready. I'm not ready. I know there's so much to learn and I'm excited for it. And then we're gonna have a next steps and calls to action. Next slide. So I want to start tonight. I want to make sure that we start tonight with a moment of silence. Our people are not meant to be on poster boards at protests. They're meant to be in homes situated in thriving communities. And while there can be no justice for stolen lives, the accountability that lies is in building a world that cherishes Black existence and repairs all of the harms and the harmful compounding systems that have been inflicted upon us. As our dear friend to the coalition, Derica Purnell, said, many people will turn George Floyd into a martyr today. We must fight to remember that he did not give his life for justice, for our movement, for an uprising. He wanted to live. He fought to live. And so with that, I want to take 30 seconds for us to have a moment of silence for George Floyd and all of those we have lost to police violence. And thank you for joining me in that moment. Next slide. So what is the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom? We are also known as the People's Coalition, or PCSF. We're base building and member-led grassroots organizations. We're racial justice, policy, and advocacy institutions. We're mostly led by Black and queer-led organizations. We represent a cross-section of communities impacted by systems of criminalization and incarceration. And we are committed to transforming the justice system and redefining public safety. Next slide. And so our steering committee, you can see there on our beautiful slide, it's BYP 100, Center for Popular Democracy, BAJI, Dream Defenders, the Leadership Conference, Law for Black Lives, Just Leadership USA, Policy Link, Justice Team Network, National Council, and I rep ACRE, Action Center on Race and the Economy. Next slide. So the 94 crime bill, we always start with grounding in what that is. It passed in 1994 under then President Bill Clinton and drafted in part by now President Joe Biden. It has been an underlying logic or narrative that started way before then and it continues into now, that locking people up makes our communities safer. Of course, it implemented the 3 strike rules and mandatory minimum sentencing. It gave us truth in sentencing laws and other incentives. It funneled billions, with a B, billions of dollars to expand and militarize police. It ended Pell Grants for those in prisons. And it passed and established VAWA, or Violence Against Women Act, and the Federal Assault Weapons Ban. Next slide. So our goal, the People's Coalition aims to dismantle and replace racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, with policies and budgets that invest in communities and decarcerate our country. Next slide. So I'm going to share a quote from one of our amazing panelists, Rukia Lumumba, who says, "For me, it is a world where our communities, our neighbors, our family members are able to actually engage in developing policies, budgets, and practices. That we begin to envision what it means not to just have representation in government, but actually have a government that's coming from the people. It may not look like the traditional voting mechanism, may look like more like ranked choice voting, may look like consensus building, may look like so many things that we just haven't taken the time to really build and envision." Next slide. So in the spirit of that, we're going to engage in a group decision-making exercise. We want to walk you through part of what we're going to do to repeal the 94 crime bill is through participatory democracy. So I'm going to put a poll up and we're going to see, do you want to learn more about PMAs through a short video, or are we going to do it through an infographic? So I'm going to launch that poll right now. I'm going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results just so you can see. So the results are, we're going to watch a short video. And so I'm going to throw it over to Jen, who's going to share that video with us. And give us 1 second and we'll pull that video up for you.
I asked the question, do you like you are here?
Yes!
Somebody say Southern Movement Assembly.
Southern Movement
Southern Movement Assembly.
Southern Movement Assembly.
And that's why we are here.
Voting is a legacy, making a priority.
We all count, we will not be erased.
After the election, Michael wants to see the game.
We all count, we will not be erased.
Across the country square, our movement is not dead.
We all count, we will not be erased.
Black and white and Mexican, united, we will make our stand.
We all count, we will not be erased.
Today, Pearl showed us.
We all count, we will not be erased.
All over Georgia,
We all count, we will not be erased.
down in Alabama,
We all count, we will not be erased.
North Carolina,
We all count, we will not be erased.
Tennessee is right and ready.
We all count, we will not be erased.
Down in Texas,
We all count, we will not be erased.
Texas sharp,
We all count, we will not be erased.
Arkansas is off the call.
We all count, we will not be erased.
South Carolina,
We all count, we will not be erased.
and so is Delta.
We all count, we will not be erased. We all count, we will not be erased. We all count, we will not be erased.
Now we got the Texas.
We all count, we will not be erased.
You only have to look to the left of there to see my installation. It's too different right there.
Thank you so much. We're going to bring that slideshow back up and walk you through some examples of participatory democracy.
As usual, Detroit is still ahead of the curve and beating everybody out.
So as we pull this back up, we're going to ask this question: what is participatory democracy? So it's a model of democracy in which citizens have the power to decide directly on policy, and politicians are responsible for implementing those policy decisions. And that definition comes from Khan Academy. A representative democracy is a process that elects representatives or groups to make decisions on behalf of the people. And so what we're trying to build is a participatory democracy where we tell them and they implement. Next slide. So the history of PMAs, many people will ask, well, where has this worked before? This is something you all have made up. And it's not. It's something that has worked all over the world. It's not just in this country. It has been something that has happened. So there are examples of a Pan-African Congress in Tanzania in 1974, the Zapatistas Liberation Movement in Mexico in 1994, in Cairo in 2001, all with the goals to advance the practice of people power, self-determination, and governance. In the United States, PMAs were used by the SNCC organizers in 1965 in a tent city to fight Jim Crow apartheid. So these are things that have happened. If you look here, right in South Africa, and you'll hear about that during the panel. And more recently, community organizers across the country have used PMAs to gather people impacted by injustices, to analyze what is happening in communities, and to create collective plans of action to address those conditions. Next slide. And it's a little hard to see, so we'll go right to the next slide. And you'll hear more about people's movement assemblies throughout this panel. And so I'm really excited to toss it over to my friend Dwight Bullard from Florida Rising and the amazing panelists who will walk you through how they have put this into action. So Dwight, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and good evening, family. I'm Dwight Bullard. I'm the Senior Political Advisor at Florida Rising, based in Miami. So happy to be here, and also part of the advisory board for PCSF. So yeah, I'm not going to spend much time on me because we have such a dope and dynamic group of folks that are looking forward to enlightening you all tonight. So I want to introduce to some, and I'm sure many of you know these names very well. Our first panelist tonight is AJ Williams. AJ Williams was with Durham Beyond Policing, a grassroots campaign to divest from policing, prisons, and reinvest in Black and Brown communities. Welcome, AJ. Next up, we have Mercedes Fulbright. Mercedes is an organizer with the Texas Working Families Party, the progressive, multiracial, feminist political movement fighting to build a Texas that works for the many, not the few. We also have with us tonight Zelda Holtzman with the Tshisimani Center for Activist Education, which supports activists in their struggles against racism, sexism, poverty, and the inequality in Cape Town, South Africa. So she's coming to us all the way from the mother continent, and we welcome you this evening on the East Coast or on the time over here. But good morning to you over there in South Africa. We also have, or will soon to have, Rukia Lumumba. Rukia is a transformative justice strategist and community organizer. She is the founder and executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute, as well as co-director of the Electoral Justice Voter Fund for Movement for Black Lives. So again, I told you it's going to be a dynamic panel. Looking forward to the education that they're going to impart not only on us, but I'm looking at it especially to learn something myself this evening. So we're just going to jump right into it, if that's okay. As I see the panelists are here and popping up. So we're going to jump into the first question. And first question for the panelists is, many of us have grown up with the definition of democracy as a government by the people and for the people. Yet as panelists, your work is tied to creating a real link between that definition and communities that have never experienced democracy in that way. How are you helping to create that link, and what challenges have you faced along the way? And I'm gonna, use facilitator's privilege and start with Zelda.
Oh, wow, thanks for putting me on this. And thanks also for this invitation. I'm really privileged to be participating in this teach-in, and I'm also here to learn and convinced that I will take a lot more with me than what I would put on the table. So yeah, I think that it's probably appropriate to address this question by emphasizing the context, the South African context, firstly noting that if we talk about the definition of democracy, government by the people, of the people, for the people, was like a recitation that we recited, not knowing what it meant, because it was totally outside of our experience, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, where there was anything but democracy. In fact, there was a tyranny of the state and a violent state for that matter. So my experience of democracy was the ideal, was aspirational, and it was also propelled by the Freedom Charter as our mobilizing document, an aspirational document of what democracy should be and should deliver for all our peoples who have been denied all of those rights since the onset of colonialism. And that's taking us back to nearly 400 years ago. So our democracy is a very young democracy. It's 27-year-old democracy. So it's baby steps compared to other contexts by what is in the classical term defined as democracy. But when we speak about true democracy, participatory democracy of the people, by the people, and putting that aspirational ideals into practice, then I would say that we have made a number of significant strides towards that objective. However, I would want to point out that the moment in history that was presented to us with our transition to a democratic state, to a constitutional democracy, was a moment in which we won ground, but also lost ground. And I'll talk more to that in terms of what the moment represented, in as far as the opportunity that presented us to take our country into a different trajectory. However, what we do see and what is holding us back, and want to put that out as a challenge for all of us engaging in the democratic project, is our inability, and I think part of the challenges that we're dealing with is the extent to which we were unable to dissect coloniality and its legacies and its manifestations as a continuity from a previous system, but under the guise of democracy. So the Westminster democratic system and constitutional democracy presents all the facades of what is in that textbook recitation of democracy by the people, for the people. In addition to that, I also want to put forward another challenge that I've been grappling with myself, and that is sort of, why were we unable to grasp that moment at that particular time when we were presented with that opportunity to transform into the ideals as we mobilized around in the Freedom Charter, a document which people died for, a document that was illegal, a document that was powerful, yet when we had the opportunity to take it forward and to implement it, things gave way, right? So what are these things? And I think I want to just put forward one of the key challenges for me is that it's easier to resist and organize around an ideal in the face of visible pain and visible repression. And to resist at the moment, it's far more difficult to build a future that is a reimagination of an alternative. In that lies a difficulty, and it presents itself in ways in which we engage in the democratic project. And it's easier, therefore, to succumb to an electoral democracy, even though the struggle in South Africa was based on the ideals of a participatory democracy. I'm foregrounding the Freedom Charter because even in your presentation, in our common histories of resistance, there's always been some guiding document of this future, a future state. And in the implementation of that, that is where the contestation around power plays itself out, which gives shape to the type of democracy that seemingly the powers that be become more comfortable with, and we are pacified into accepting that that is the version of democracy. So our contestation today in South Africa is about that very question, defending a real participatory democracy that's based on substantive participation. So I'll speak to that maybe in the next opportunity. I'm just wanting to put out sort of headlines around the challenges that we face with in as far as implementing this ideal of a people's democracy, calling again and foregrounding the opening lines of the Freedom Charter in one of the clauses, and it talks to the people shall govern. Our constitution also talks about we the people, and prescribes a people's government, but in practice, when those in power fought for the very freedoms and the ideals, once in power, the building process towards that democracy gives way to expediency. And that is a very big pullback factor, I think, into how democracy is practiced. We're now in a situation where in South Africa, people would say to you, because of unemployment, because of inequality, because of racial injustices, because of the legacies of the past and the continuing legacies of the past in the present, and they would say to you, what is democracy? We can't eat it. We can't live it because it's not protected, it's not defended, and those who are empowered to do so are not there for us. So we have to establish, re-establish, and reimagine a people's democracy and start from the ground. And I'll speak to what we've internalized as substantive democracy and processes that we're engaging through People's Assembly towards that objective. So I'll just leave it there for that question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Zelda. Again, jewels abound, so I'm glad this is being recorded. I'm gonna kick it over to AJ to answer that same question. Did you need me to repeat that, AJ, or you got it?
I got the question. Thank you. I feel really honored to be here. So yeah, I wanted to give some context about Durham Beyond Policing and how we formed, and connect that dot or those dots of how there have been challenges along the way. So Durham Beyond Policing is a coalition. We founded it in 2016, and it was after our city council announced a plan to build a $71 million new police headquarters. And between 2016 and 2017, Durham Beyond Policing actually, which includes local organizations like DUIP 100, the Durham chapter, the Southerners on New Ground chapter in Durham, and UE 150, which is a public service workers union. And so there was a survey that went out to residents on how they would want to spend $71 million. And so that was the kind of first participatory method used, and overwhelmingly, as we often see, policing didn't make the cut, right? There were things like affordable housing and quality healthcare and quality public transportation that made the list. It turns out that the police department ended up getting their new facility, but one of the wins that actually came out of that fight was Durham's participatory budgeting pilot program. So now I've served as a steering committee member actually for 2 years now. And so the city allocated $2.4 million out of a $500 million budget, by the way, which is pennies in terms of municipalities, but whatever. And that was across 3 wards. So residents got to determine how those funds would be spent on one-time capital projects. I think the most exciting part of that process was the way that we engaged residents throughout the entire civic process. And even as a steering committee, you know, including shared language in our agreements that grounded the process in shifting power and transforming harm, ensuring resources were allocated in ways that corrected past harms and funding the needs of the people who were most impacted. And so finally, Durham Beyond Policing put forth a proposal to City Council for a community-led safety and wellness task force. And that was in resistance to Durham Police Department's proposal to add 72 new cops to the force over 3 years. We were actually able to block that. We sent about what felt like 1,000 people to City Hall that night to sing. We sang "Going to Get My Baby Out of Jail," and we passed out our proposal to City Council and their clerks. And so we actually won in a 4-3 vote. We were able to get our proposal for the task force through. We were able to get part-time city workers an increased wage of $15 per hour. And we got funding towards our eviction diversion program. And so now we have this task force in place. Currently, they just had their first meeting like 2 weeks ago. And so that's going to prioritize the experience of community and the expertise of community and determining what safety looks like. And so also running concurrently to that, Durham Beyond Policing is creating the infrastructure to launch a long-term participatory action project, and it's based on the participatory action research methodology. And so we're going to be centering the voices of community most impacted by gun violence, which typically takes a spike in the summertime, as in most cities, and particularly, we're keeping our eyes on it because of the pandemic. To name one of the challenges, I kind of want to tell a quick story. So in the PB process, I think one of the challenges is the way white folks show up in participatory spaces. And so in our first round of that PB process, in the first year, we had budget delegates who are volunteers from across many spectrums of the community, but primarily Black and brown folks who we wanted to put in these roles as volunteers, and they helped develop the ideas that were submitted from folks. And so this wasn't true across the board, but there was a white woman who came to the first budget delegate meeting, and we broke out into groups by project category, and she seemed really shell-shocked, like at who had been chosen along with her as budget delegates. And it was clear she was probably college educated, middle to upper class, and assumed that she would be leading a group. And so she kept turning to everybody and being like, well, what do you do? What do you do? And we said, we're on the steering committee, but really we were just facilitating and passing out name tags and stuff like that. It wasn't that deep. But actually she burst into tears and she said, this is not what I thought it was gonna be. And so it's this kind of like white savior hubris that she brought into the space, where she only wanted to participate if she played a role that felt more class appropriate, or even just having a trust for Black and brown folks as experts of their own experience, or even worthy enough to be meaningfully included in a participatory process. And that was really striking to me.
You just preached the word there, my brother. I appreciate the insight, and definitely shout out to the young activist that was in the background shouting you on there. And as a part of the whole thing, we always love the babies. So no doubt. Mercedes, I'm coming to you.
Yeah. So for me, we've been experimenting in Dallas with different forms of direct democracy, participatory democracy. And I'm just thinking about 2 years ago, before the COVID, before the last summer's uprisings, we did a People's Town Hall on safety through a group called Our City, Our Future. And particularly in South Dallas, where I live, that summer, we reached the highest crime the city's ever reached in the last 30 years. And of course, the city's response to that was that we need to invest in more policing. And then the governor deployed state troopers, particularly like in my neighborhood on my block for weeks on end. And then the only way we could get them out was when they actually killed an unarmed Black man. And in that town hall, we were asking folks to give us their vision of safety. And to map that out on chart paper, as well as through written notes and like audio messages for folks who couldn't attend. And in that, we discovered, which we've done this many times in many spaces for many years in the city, that people never mentioned police prisons or guns as a form of safety. And opening up conversations like that with your community members and folks that you live near, you have this opportunity to have a conversation about the fact that there's a budget that our city is getting really riled up about, that wants us to fight for us to invest in policing. And everything that you all have said about what keeps us safe doesn't include that. And so in those conversations, there is like this opportunity to do like some reshifting of people's minds around the budget, around our local government and how they use our taxes and our dollars, but alongside the divestment that people are seeing in our community and the ways that we can advocate for that. And so we took that in 2019, and then, you know, today, 1 year anniversary, just a year ago, that same fight translated into this bigger, bolder demand around divesting from policing. And so with COVID as a backdrop, we had to make the space virtual. And with Rukia's help, trained many of our new organizers and new individuals who joined our coalition in defense of Black Lives Dallas, introduced our city to people's assemblies. And in that space, it was a more transformative conversation, an opportunity to build a people's budget and demands that us as organizers, us as an ecosystem of individuals, residents, concerned folks in the community came together based off of that weekend of people's assemblies that we did through Zoom to be able to advocate for things like, you know, drug diversion programs, affordable housing in a city where folks are being pushed out to the suburbs, fighting for trans lives because the city of Dallas is #1 in violence towards Black trans women. And we were able to come up with those demands because the people's assemblies that we held that weekend, much of those conversations came up. There were polls that we did. We had breakout rooms. There were facilitated conversations where community members were the folks who facilitated, not the people who actually hosted the event. And so, you know, we're going into our second year of fighting for this budget through this coalition that we formed last summer. And the goal is to do it again. And we want to have this hodgepodge of, you know, in person if you're vaccinated, but also give people the space to do it online as well, in the hopes that the demands are still the same, but that it's a little bit more expansive and more inclusive of different districts that we couldn't reach last year because of the pandemic. I think the biggest challenge that comes up, right, is just inaccessibility, right? I'm thinking of the senior citizens that we missed last summer versus when we got to meet in person and have these spaces. Like my elders in my community, they show up in these moments, but Zoom was not accessible, you know, last year for us to reach that base. And then challenges around just language justice, right? I live in a state that is predominantly Latinx, so Spanish speaking was a barrier that we actually had to confront within our coalition. And just offering all sorts of actual language justice for different communities across Dallas. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but I think outside of that, of course, the tension around different people's needs and what they believe are priorities, and actually getting into the practice of consensus building, right? That in itself is a practice that I think as a community, being in spaces like that, it forces you to do it on the spot, and you have to gain a muscle as you do it. So for us, we're trying to make people's assembly a consistent thing that where consensus building within our community feels normal, and it doesn't feel like, you know, we're pitting each other against each other. And I'm also thinking just about the old saying, that not old saying, but the myth that folks have about Black people wanting police, right? I remember being at a town hall that the city hosted, and, you know, 50 folks said that they wanted police and they look just like me. And then myself and a few other folks who were committed to uplifting a different narrative said something different. And folks were like, hey man, sister, that's it. And they just needed a different worldview. And then after that, another 50 people came to the mic and they were like, you know what, actually, yes, right? And so that was a challenge in itself, was that, you know, folks come in with a particular socialization, right? We believe that police keep us safe. And so there was tension at the beginning of many of our spaces that we held, where it's just why are we talking about this? But then when we go through that visioning exercise, then you start to see, oh, my ideas about this are actually rooted in something else. And it took me being in a community with other folks with different ideas for us to get to this place for me to say, actually, no, I would rather spend, you know, my dollars or my time on public parks for the kids, right? So they can stop shooting in the street, right? Activities, things like that, that doesn't require us to call 911 for them to intervene. So I'll stop there, but yeah, that's what we've been up to.
That's beautiful. We're gonna close out this question with Rukia. By all means, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. It's a great panel. It's like my favorite topic. So thank you. Thanks for having me. Rukia Lumumba, I'm with the People's Advocacy Institute here in Jackson, Mississippi, and with the Jackson People's Assembly, which we've been doing since in its current formation since 2006, right after Hurricane Katrina. We began to do assemblies in direct reaction to the need for our people to rebuild across Mississippi and Louisiana. And so we've been doing it ever since. Prior to that, we did other formations of assemblies. One assembly was one where we, the Human Rights Coalition Assembly, where we actually chose the first Black person to run for mayor, right? You know, it was, and so that was a process, and that was back in the 1990s here in Jackson, Mississippi. Our current iteration of assemblies sounds so much like the wealth of information that people have shared today. And so I will try not to repeat what I've heard, but I will try to add to the conversation. For us, the assembly really is a form of community-led governance. That is our goal, is getting to a place where community is actually making the decisions, and folks we put into office are just following to actually do the task work to make it happen, right? And so that direct democracy that Mercedes was talking about. The assembly process for us, we have gone through it in several iterations. When we don't have city power, right now we have a very friendly mayor. We have a mayor that believes in people's assemblies and utilizes them to help make decisions. And it is actually through the assembly process over the past years that we've seen the current administration be more inclusive of community in terms of the decisions that it makes in terms of policies and governance as a whole. So it's the first time in Jackson's history that we've had community participation in the development of the city plan, right? And so, you know, most folks know that a city plan is that 20-year document that every city develops around how they're going to develop their city and make it improve the quality of life for all residents. This is the first time residents are actually able to participate in that, right? We held our first participatory budgeting assembly in 2019, the first ever that we were able to hold. And the people had the opportunity to vote on the entire, to set the priorities on the entire budget. And that felt really refreshing and beautiful. But you know, one thing that continues to be a hard place is around funding in public safety. So one of the most important aspects of an assembly is to ensure that the solutions that are developed, because assemblies are really about solutions, right? And so what we've noticed, for example, is, I'll give an example, our crime and safety assembly that we held. Great attendance, folks came out overwhelmingly. This was back in 2018. Overwhelmingly, people talked about public safety as not police, right? Including the police that were in the room, right? And so we saw this desire for some community-led efforts around safety and what that looks like. Mental health, over and over and over again, that's all you heard. Assistance with housing, over and over and over again, that's all you heard. Mentorship, youth programs, right? This is what we heard. And so fast forward when in the city, through the mayor's office, you know, supported the efforts and pushed for some funding to go towards the development of the exact programs that community members had asked for around community-led governance. But then we had that block from city council, right? And so we've consistently had this block from our city council. And so though we have a mayor that's in support, it's city council that controls the budget. And so what the assembly process has done is encourage members and residents that want to actually come now and run for office so that we can follow the lead of AJ and Durham and what they're doing around getting people elected on city council and not just in the mayoralship run. The other thing that we found is that the importance around assemblies being spaces that are not owned by one organization. Here in Jackson, we believe that the assembly is the property of the people. It is the space of the people, and that the assembly takes on two formations. It takes on the formation of an event, but it also takes on the formation of a process of shifting the way that we look at governance until the point where we're no longer being governed, but we're actually in the process of governing. So what does it mean to actually for a mayor or a city council person to walk into an assembly, walk into a room and present the policies and or the policy or issue that's before city council or before the mayor's office? And instead of sitting there and saying, this is what we're gonna do, saying this is what we're thinking of doing, and having community actually vet that process and that policy. When my father, the late Mayor Chokwe Lumumba, was in office, that's how he operated, not only as city council person, but also as mayor. He would walk into an assembly room and say, how should I vote? And that is taking the power and putting it in the hands of the people, not in the hands of one individual that we've elected to represent us. And so I think there's a shift in understanding what leadership is, and that leadership is collective, and that we have to engage in those difficult processes that Mercedes talked about around consensus building, which we got folks who are on the assembly coordinating committee who are like, they hate the consensus building process. They say it takes too long, but it's worth it in the end because everybody has that buy-in. And we see change happen in really important ways because we're not just fighting for the liberation of spaces, we're fighting for the liberation of our minds to help us understand that we deserve the right? We deserve the right to govern. We deserve the right to actually take hold of the policies and practices and dictate what those should be. And so that's what we're really working towards here in Jackson. We're trying to take it a step further. We're trying to push our not only our mayor's office, but now our city council. When people show up, we occupied last year in 2020, all the way up into January of this year, 2021, we occupied City Hall. The People's Assembly members just occupied City Hall. Residents just occupied City Hall for every city council meeting because we were upset about decisions that they had made. And every time we show up, they began to listen. So there's that real power in the people's voice.
So staying along those same lines, Rukia, and starting with you, many people subscribe to the notion of just like throw the whole thing away, right? Like start over, begin fresh, kind of deconstruct the whole system and just build anew. Others are along the mindset that reform is possible, that, the so-called founding fathers in the creation of this democracy have created some sort of construct that can work if you just reform it the right way. So starting with you, kind of where do you fall on that spectrum if we're looking at it as a spectrum? And can you offer some advice or solutions to folks on how to better agitate, how to better move this thing along, or how to dismantle this thing and start fresh, depending on where you fall?
So I'm an abolitionist, right? So I'm always trying to transform things, to disrupt, to deconstruct and create something new, right? I do not think that the current system that we have was one built on a true democracy or a direct democracy, one in which our people, which the majority or the masses of the people have a right to participate and engage in a true leadership and effective way. However, I understand that we have to have interventions to get us to that place. We have to experiment as well to get us to the place where we actually can see and begin to dream about what it is we really want. Because I don't know if we even know what it is we really want, right? Not even us as advocates completely, right? I also know that we can't want something as advocates without engaging the masses of our people in that discussion. One of the lessons we learned early on in our assembly process was when we walked into an assembly. This was during Katrina. And, I remember my father was talking about all of this great stuff about we want justice, we want liberation, we want all these things. And one of the men sitting on this was at a church, sitting on the pew set, sitting in the audience, on the pew set, well, in the meeting, there's no audience in an assembly, said, man, I hear you with all of this racial justice stuff, but I just want you to fix this pothole, right? Because every time I drive down the street and my car hits this pothole, my rim is now cracked. My tire is now flat, and I got to replace this whole thing. And that's money. And now I'm late for work. So my advice is that we engage in the very processes of beginning to educate our folks around what those possibilities are. Engaging in a process of just opening up the opportunity for people to see something different. But then we engage in a deep listening. Once we open those doors, engage in a deep listening. Come with your ideas, but come understanding that your idea may not be the solution, and that where our people are is where we have to move. The other piece is that as it's a trajectory, and I'll be quiet because I know other people got to talk. But so we do the education, we do the listening, and then we began to experiment. Miriam Kaba once told me, because I was just bugging her, I just kept saying, we were trying to build this community led violence interruption program here, and I just was filled with anxiety about, like, is it going to go well? Like, what do we do? And it was taking a long time for us to produce it. And she said, you just got to move. It's not going to be perfect. You just got to experiment. Just do it, right? And I think we have to actually just step out and do it. Take the risk. It's not going to be perfect, but we have to begin to take those risks to actually experiment with the projects that we want to see come to fruition. And then lastly, as we're experiencing that, we can't lose sight of our vision, right? We can't lose sight of our goal. And that is that we have to remind ourselves consistently that, one, we are not engaging in the governance process to simply be a part of bureaucracy. Two, that we're not electing people into office for them to hold the seat. We're electing people into office for them to disrupt the institution that they're in and to begin to create something new. And so we have to also, as they're doing that, we got to support our folks, and we got to hold them accountable in that process. I hope that's helpful.
It's helpful to me. I hope it's helpful to other folks as well. Mercedes, you have some thoughts.
Yeah. Rukia is my big sister. So the fact that I just get to be in your space, like, I'm on the same wavelength, and I've learned so much from you, Rukia. So, as someone who is an abolitionist as well, as an abolitionist organizing spaces, like, I always sit in this contradiction of wanting to throw the system away while also recognizing that abolition is about presence, right? And it's not about absence. And when I think about that absence piece, it is definitely easy to just step away and say, I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to involve myself in this. And also in that, I live in a city that is Dallas. I live in a state that is Texas, that is ran by Republicans who absolutely hate the color of my skin, the gender that I'm in, the body that I'm in, and have to understand and recognize that it requires me to participate. It requires me to, like, be in line with my people when they're standing in lines for 90 minutes to 3 hours to vote, because for them, that is their lever, that is their access to getting simple things changed in their communities, right? Like, that is what we have right now. And that is not to say that this system cannot be thrown away, but right now the political conditions are not right for that system to be thrown away without our people being thrown away with it, right? And that is, like, what I sit in as an organizer, as someone who, doesn't get to live in one of these blue progressive cities and states, and can, continue to have these radical demands and know that it actually is going to take a lot more than just shouting and marching, right? And so for me, I look at this piece around throwing away the system as an opportunity to reinsert, remotivate, re-empower my people in the act of building democracy and building a multiracial democracy and starting at the local level, right? And so I don't divest from, like, the simple access of voting. And I don't want to get on a tangent about, like, oh, we must vote and vote or die, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm actually saying that there's an opportunity to continue to, like, push this piece, but also build these alternatives while contending for power, right? Like, I am so in the business of contending for power, opposed to just, like, let me remove myself, let me do something that doesn't like, either enable or perpetuate the system, but not contend for power. Like my people must contend for power. And in that, I recognize that on the left, we have people, the right has capital, right? And in that, because I'm on the left, there are more people than there is the money that they have. And so for me, I see the work that I am doing as organizing my people in the same way that they organize money. And we have more people, and there's a commitment that I have in doing that when it comes to the re-motivating, re-empowering, educating our base, moving them to our side. Because again, when I'm in these spaces and my folks come in with these, notions about safety and policing and things that, we've been taught in school through white supremacist, teachings. Again, I'm in the South, I'm in Texas, so much of this has been ingrained. Texas pride is pretty much white supremacy, in that when we offer up a different vision, our people, they get it. They got it. They're like, absolutely. And they also recognize that they're doing it every day. They're doing the alternatives while also trying to survive and thrive through this system. And throwing it away will leave them behind. And we have to be honest about that as organizers. We are responsible not only to ourselves, to our people. And I do think a part of the throwing away the system piece is also reinserting this piece around accountability to each other, right? And the fact that we need to be in the business of accountability when we talk about building a democracy. And I do feel as though we are detached as a country, right? Built on its foundation, detached from this accountability, not only to each other, but to the planet, to our families. And I believe that as individuals, we do that in our friendships and our sisterhoods and other ways. But what does it look like to do that at scale? And to me, that's the type of democracy building that I am trying to be a part of, where accountability is done at scale, where we actually think about what we consume, how we move through the world, how we treat each other, how that impacts each other in ways that either harms or helps each other. And so for me, throwing away the system is absolutely like my North Star with this hope to rebuild, but it's also with the understanding of the realities and the political conditions and where I live, that it does require me to be present, to participate, to push, to contend for that power, and to bring our people along and not leave them behind and throw them away with that system.
Listen, okay, I was about to have a real Baptist church moment and start shouting in a second, but I'm gonna hold back is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to hold back. I was raised Episcopal. So
you got Southerners on here, so
I got discipline enough to hold back.
Some church folks.
So if you clapping or you breaking up the tambourines, feel free to do it, but just on mute, folks, is what we're trying to just on. But you can go ahead and shout and throw up your hands, out there in the webinar world. So AJ, I want to come to you, kind of with the same question, but I also want to tee up Zelda because, as she mentioned in her earlier comment, she's dealing with a very young democracy. So this concept of starting anew, maybe something that is under consideration in South Africa, or maybe they're like looking at this so-called American experiment and saying, how can I make the right changes? So I want to come to you first to kind of, dovetail on what's already been said, but then I definitely want to hear from Zelda about, her kind of interpretation of this question from the South African perspective. So AJ.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this question is one, that the movement often interrogates. It's like what possibilities are available in terms of shifting power within these existing institutions. And we've seen it be possible across many people's movements, particularly in the global South. But it did require a deep agitation from within that system. And the electeds had to come forth from the people and had to have the same school of thought of the people and could not be corrupted by the system. And then the outside strategy, which is having a strong base building strategy in the support of the people. So in my opinion, half of the struggle is convincing folks of their own power. And that makes sense because powerful isn't necessarily a shape that we're familiar with. And we're also up against this neoliberal machine that's constantly pumping out skin folk who are fluent in the language and support the interests of upholding whiteness. So contextually speaking, the social construct in which we live is one where whiteness is a norm, and that's a continuum of settler colonialism. And so we can't actually preserve this system as is without uprooting it. But we can talk about anti-reformist reforms. We can talk about the fact that we are doing this in real time, right? Like we talk about it as if it's like some future thing. This is actually what we're doing. Is, you know, we're not living in some parallel universe. And so we are dismantling the system while we're functioning in it. Everybody on this call is, right? We are creating opportunities for co-governance. We're finding our folks and we're putting them in position. And we're making it so that they can change the material conditions of our people and be accountable to the people and shape the political landscape to get the wins that we need. And so I also think about the way that the pandemic has really, it's created this world, right? Like where we've gotten this glimpse of what it might look like for capitalism to crumble, right? Like we saw the ways that the economic system just broke, and that prompted so many like mutual aid efforts, right? Where, you know, Black, queer, trans, femme folks were in leadership. We're making things happen. We're figuring out ways for folks to get diapers and food, right? And so, and to me, I kept saying like, man, like this feels good. Like, I don't know that I want to go back to, I mean, we've all probably had that thought, right? Like in some way, shape or form, because what are we going back to? And here in Durham, we're actually, we just introduced this campaign, Tend to Transform, where we are simultaneously, right, doing an invest, divest strategy. So our demand was for 10% of the sheriff and the police budget to be reallocated, the positions inside of those departments to be reallocated to our new Office of Community Safety and Wellness. And so we're pushing that right now, right? And so the simultaneous act of like pulling money out of the police and investing in community. So yeah, I think it's, I just want to reiterate that this is something that we're doing in the now, right? It's not like this far-fetched like fantasy world, like we are doing the shit right now, like folks, you know, so yeah.
That's amazing. I know I do want to go to Zelda, but this is the point in the conversation where I got to ask you to break out your pens and paper, because I have to morph a couple questions into one because we're closing out on time. We're getting short on time. And so I want to honor one of the questions that is coming in from the chat on, is there an opportunity, or have you seen an opportunity to develop actual ordinances around participatory democracy or budgeting at the local level? Like, have you actually been able to hold city councils or county, you know, councils accountable in a transformative way, where they've passed some sort of ordinance to make room for that? But also within the framework of that question, and this is kind of like the question after Zelda's comments for everyone, how do you view participation, you know, for the novice, right? For somebody who may not be coming to the assemblies that you started, or may not be coming to the meetings, who's kind of sitting around overwhelmed at the idea of how do I involve myself in a transformative process, right? What is that kind of golden nugget that you can leave with that person as that first step to get them out of that anxiety that they may be feeling around how to get involved in the process? So I'm leaving that there to sit with you all, marinate on that process. That Zelda, I'm coming to you in the framework of the current question. How are you viewing things from the South African standpoint on this concept of how do you maintain the democracy that you've been building over the last 27 years? Are you envisioning maybe sort of a reimagination, as you touched on in your previous comments, around what this democracy looks like on the continent, if you're still with us? Yeah, there we go.
I've just been blabbering away there. No, I'm not falling asleep yet, although it's probably 2 a.m. in the morning. 10 cups of coffee is getting me going, and the conversation, and I think just sort of taking in, but I must say, the Americans, you talk a lot. I mean, you know, and I could sit and listen and just absorb and take that in. So thanks for that. It's energizing me as well. Dwight, I think I want to sort of, you know, just take us a little bit back in order to move forward. Now, Democratic practices is within our DNA. It's within our archaeology, and it's within our historiography of struggle. Democratic participation in an undemocratic state. And whilst we were contesting power, we were building people's power through democratic processes. Some of that, of course, were hampered by conditions of illegality, because even your mere participation was an illegal act. So we had to devise means to keep people engaged and to impact and influence the agenda of change. And that required us to be not only innovative and creative, but also resilient. So because we're still a young democracy, therefore I'm saying that is still within our DNA, it's still within our archaeology, and it's still within our recent historiography. So what do we draw from that? Before we get to that point, in the mobilization for a people's power and building that, laying and building the scaffolding, having the foundation for participatory democracy, and I want to give examples of it. For example, in the period of ungovernability, where we were attempting to make the apartheid state ungovernable and to hold a counterpower, a people's power. At that point, in many pockets of South Africa, we had street committees that were organized on a door-by-door basis, street-by-street basis, block-by-block basis. And because we were anti-state and we engaged in non-state strategies, we also had to hold the peace, because the police wasn't there for us. They were policing on a political motive and agenda, with all the atrocities that accompany that. And to capture and hold that space, we devised ways and means to engage communities in a way that the community itself, whether that community is the street, that community is the block, it could be a few houses in the shack, or it could be in a rural area, etc., irrespective of the size. The objective was for people to engage in organic processes of dispute resolution and community peace building and peace holding. There was no presence for the police. In fact, the peace was held because the police was absent. When the police was present, violence was provoked and violence was meted out by the police. So they could therefore not even be considered as an instrument for peace building, peacemaking, community protection, etc. Although in the new dispensation, all of that is prescribed in law and inscribed in those regulated participatory processes, so-called, and say it's regulated into existence. Now, I want to combine sort of two questions, so I know we're running out of time, but also to just throw in some of the current context. So in building up in this, from the contestation of two opposing forces, the upholders of apartheid and a people's power project that emerge as through a form of resistance and because of resistance. With the dispensation or the transition to a democratic South Africa, when I spoke about that moment, was that possibility we're addressing here to change the system. And we organized, we fought for that. People died with a vision of a changed system that made no provision of any element of an apartheid state, of a colonial state, of a capitalist state, I dare say, within a framework of our imagined futures. What has happened as a consequence of the transition is that democratic processes were usurped by the state and appropriated by the state and regulated the very participatory processes born out of struggle into the state machinery. So our constitution, for example, prescribes that every police precinct shall have a community police forum. And ostensibly, with the spirit of the law, the operative word would be community police forum, through which the community would hold the police to account. So that and other instruments brought about by the state, ostensibly to uphold democracy, was the very ones appropriated by power. And our great mistake, I think, was, if we reflect now, we know 2020 is perfect vision, but if we reflect on the political project, then I think I would question my naive self, as my generation would, as to why we allowed and what precipitated and what were the conditions that allowed for this usurpation of power, for nearly the hijacking of a people's power. And I would assert that one of the many conditionalities was the trust and emphasis and confidence we placed in individuals because we presumably were of the like mind, the like histories, and we traversed and traveled the same paths in the anti-apartheid struggle, and we rallied around the same ideals. So if you have people in those positions, then automatically they would hold the ideals true. However, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. Once you are given the opportunity to exercise that power and you're not held accountable in terms of the principles around which that power is governed, then privilege trumps principles, and principles goes in your back pocket, and then you see the malaise of democracies, fledgling democracies into corrupt pariah states. And that is the moment of awakening. That is our moment of reckoning as to how we should be holding power. So I want to assert maybe if our rethinking that moment and projecting into our future moments, building on existing scaffolding, building on existing building blocks that isn't too far back in our historiography, our memories, our DNA, and our processes, and to rekindle and reimagine that and foreground that in the pathways to a reimagined future. And I would say that because of our distrust of the state machinery, the distrust in leadership, the critique of what struggle also produced iconic, often male figures around which the struggle is represented and are positioned to articulate those ideals put on a pedestal to the expense and exclusion of the masses, the populace, and the very people who brought about and delivered our freedom, now factored out. We're now having and have been engaging in processes not only to reimagine, but to action that which we started building on in the apartheid days. Now, if we are to ask them a question, and from the point of view of the NGO that I work for, which is an activist education center, we pride ourselves on being pluralistic in our approach and to facilitate critical thinking and to facilitate processes where people most impacted can imagine their futures and engage in the processes to realize that. So we facilitate education engagements in a co-design, cooperative, collaborative, dialogical way, right? So we don't take a position on this is the path to power. That's my professional NGO and organizational stance. Personally, if you are to ask me, should we retain and reform the system, or should we abolish it and get rid of it? Then in my being, I would say, yes, if it's possible, of course, because it's not delivering for our people. We have growing inequality, we have growing unemployment, we have growing racial divide and tension and xenophobia and everything that the Constitution and the Freedom Charter is against. We don't have free and equal education, and yet we talk about the doors of learning and culture shall be open, there shall be houses, security and comfort, etc., and we can rattle that down. And in fact, a comrade says to me, or at some point says, well, we should have known that that was only for poetic effect. These documents and programs of action for change. So how do we mitigate against that happening again as we continue the process of building the democracy from the ground? Can we do it to the exclusion of the state? Can we discard the state, abolish the state? Because we can't look at policing separate from the state. It's a continuation of a colonial construct. It is a continuation of an instrument of power. And if the state represents a power for the people, then that instrument can be one that protects and serves. But if the state represents that very divide that favors property, favors privilege, favors the legacies of the past and continue in that vein, then obviously the schism between the state and the people will increase. And the police, when making or having to take an option between the people and the state, being paid by the state and the creation of the state, will take an option for the state. So there is no wonder, there's no a mystery in why we have police killings of protesters who contest their very democratic right enshrined in the Constitution, but stand ready armed, guns blazing, with all the paraphernalia of paramilitary policing in defense of what? Of a state, and not for the protection of the people. So the orientation and position and doctrine and training and resources are geared towards protecting a resource, protecting power, and being geared and deployed towards an enemy, which happen to be the people, happen to be those contesting their very rights in a democratic dispensation. So I would say, yes, I wish it was possible to start from scratch, have a blank slate, abolish the police and abolish all the undemocratic, corrupt and corrupting and corruptible structures of the state, and elevate that project that we started in the early 80s. And there's, I mean, I sent a presentation, and you could look at some of the examples of people's forums, people's assemblies. We didn't call it people's assemblies then. They were either Izimbizos, Bosparats, Lachotlas, within our African cultures of engagement in democratic and dialogical ways. But because we were unable, we didn't, or we were short-sighted, or power was too strong and invisible at the time, presented itself under the guise of democratic processes and a free and equal democracy and all the nice things with fist in the air, but meant something else. So I want to put forward in my own critique of that project and in the reimagination of the future is that when we look at sort of participation, then yes, I would say it is not an either or. It's not replace or reform. It's replace whilst reforming, because I do think that if we engage in a participatory process in which people's democratic processes and people's power at the local level can influence legislation, can influence the transformation of state machinery, and can lay the basis for accountability at the local level. But it comes with a concerted, conscientious, and conscious attempt towards that objective. We cannot leave that, as we've learned the hard way, in the hands of people just because we think we are of like mind. We don't always remain of like heart when we have the power and the resources to use it for our own gain and for that of the political party at the expense of the democratic project, as we've seen, and we can go on. I wouldn't want to go too much into it. As I say, I put some of those comments in the presentation that hopefully we could use as a resource at some point. So I think maybe in the reimagination of what this parallel yet influencing processes would be, I would put forward a few points that I think in our own critique of our democratic processes post-1994 in the new democratic period would be interrogating what a true ground-up approach means. Sometimes we call it that. People are invited to a meeting. Who dominates? Who sets the agenda? How ground-up is it? Because we have people most affected, and therefore it makes it legitimate, it makes it credible, but who holds the agenda? So I would put forward sort of what maybe and questioning and what we're constantly doing in our reflective, critical, and pluralistic approaches to politics would be, what does this ground-up approach really mean in practice? Who should be setting the agenda? And what are the contradictions between a people's agenda and the state agenda? So the South African government purports to be a democratic state, and we've got legislative protection in that regard. We probably have one of the best constitutions in the world that foregrounds a Bill of Rights and equality and equity provisioning, etc. Yet the practice is different. So how do we engage this contradiction between a people's power project, an ideal, and state power? What's the points of connect and disconnect? And how do we engage that process without losing power? Having had the experience of that abdication because of leadership and because of assumptions we made of where we were. And again, I think it's important that it's not only setting the agenda, but also that we have mechanisms to hold ourselves accountable to that agenda, its processes also to be democratic in nature, and its outcomes to be democratic in nature. In the reimagination of the alternatives, who again drives that, and how, and where are the checkpoints and the beacons that should be set directing us in that path, particularly because we've seen how principles get exchanged and dropped for privilege. And it doesn't matter the color of the skin, the political party, the history of struggle, the history of sacrifice, that at the flip of an opportunity that we've seen a misdirection of the ideological project of a people's power. So I would look inwardly to ourselves and in the way that we engage to really interrogate our interpretation and our analysis of various moments of the democratic project, and to look at mitigating strategies that direct us away from a people's project and a true substantive participation. I would also think that if we look at sort of the democratic project and people's participation, that not all people are equal. So we talk about people's democracy and people's assembly. Not all people are equal, given our differing histories, but also particularly the impacts of undemocratic practices, be it repression, be it violence of the state or corporates that exclude people, that further discriminates against people, etc. So do we enter our assemblies, do we enter democratic processes on a basis of equality? I think for me personally, and I think politically, I would think that as a flawed position, because the issue of equality can never be the same if people are impacted because they are poor, because they're working class, because they're women, because they're LGBTI, because they're brown or black, and assume that we all come to the party on the basis of equality. So that also is a position that often is usurped and used by power under the banner of the people. Now the people are differentiated on the spectrum of inequality, and therefore for equal participation that intersect on what makes people unequal systemically and otherwise should be addressed in the process of substantive engagement. Right. So I would have said, in the example that I mentioned of the kitchen assemblies, it's a project very localized in a working class community that during apartheid would have been associated with probably the intifadas of South Africa at the time, would probably be equated with, in the probably global context, the way South African politics would have been understood then, would probably be equated with the Soweto of Johannesburg, or the Soweto of South Africa, Bonteheuwel would be to the Western Cape. Working class community with very high intensity in engagement in the anti-apartheid struggle. Now one of the most depressed communities economically, who do not have the benefit of the freedoms they fought for and the experiences of democracy that delivers for them in tangible ways, whether it's housing, sanitation, education, or any aspect of the human condition that would make real those democratic ideals. And the women started organizing initially because of gender-based violence, then developed the project further, linking back, going full circle back into the ideals of a people's power as fought for during apartheid, and resurface the imagination of what a people's democracy, people-led and people-held democracy, and at the center of that, women-directed and women-led. Because we've seen the further impacts of inequality on women who have been the most unequal, particularly Black women, Black working class women, Black working class and rural women. And so we could go down the spectrum on that divide or spectrum or continuum of oppression, repression, and exploitation. So they started reimagining a future outside of state intervention and started building in the same way, block by block, door by door, street by street, around this project for a people's power. And they've gone to the extent where they bring in, because of the assertion of the level of participation, substantive participation, not academics, and I'm not saying anything against academics, I mean, all welcome in this space and great contribution, but not outsiders looking in being articulate about what should be, but people are experiencing that disconnect between the ideal and the lived reality determine their agenda, to the extent that they were able to call and still call government officials at the different levels, whether it's national, provincial, or local, to account at the street level in a shack if necessary. And one of the pictures I sent also where the women were gathering to discuss the issues of the day, whether it is their safety, gender-based violence, housing, or service delivery or non-delivery of government, but also their sustainability beyond the intervention or rather expectations of what government should or would deliver, but could or do not deliver. So they move beyond that. So that is the point I'm making as to the possibility of the people's democratic project at the local level have the potential to influence state structure and the transformation of the state towards a democratic project. So it's processes we talk about the scaffolding that hopefully through these arrangements and engagements, not only at the very local level, but also translocal level, transnational level, and as we've seen increasing on a global level around the similar objective of deconstructing power, deconstructing the colonial legacies of power, particularly in the police, as a concept of a colonial power, and reimagining together, I would imagine, through a number of platforms, one such as this and many other platforms, a future interconnected to each other, connected through our collective past of colonial oppression into a collective future of managing and imagining and reimagining a world in which power relations would manifest in very different ways based on and because of substantive grassroots participation that holds democracy, which I would think, I'd like to use the term, a grounded accountability to the democratic project and not a state-led, state-orientated, state entity or state-driven democratic project. And I think that is where we fall politically flat on our face because we assume that you put people in the state and therefore things would happen. No,
so
we have
Zelda, I don't want to be the one to cut you off, but time is cutting me off. I do apologize. You were going in like a visiting lecturer at an HBCU, and I was writing notes, and I loved it. As a FAMU graduate, I felt all that in my spirit. But I do want to at least give everyone a chance to nibble on that last question I had, because Zelda did break down all the question about if you embed in the Constitution, you still have to create a system of accountability. So she ate that first part alive. So I do want to give each of the other panelists just a quick second to go to that second part, which is if someone is listening tonight that is just trying to get involved and doesn't know where to begin, if you could leave them with a nugget, and I'm sorry I have to give everybody about 60 seconds to drop that jewel, and then we want to kick it over to Cameron to close us out and with some housekeeping stuff. So starting with Mercedes, then AJ, then Rukia. If you could give us that, where do people begin to participate?
Yeah, my go-to is always like, join an organization, start an organization, but I'm gonna go beyond that and say like, invite folks to your home, vaccinated with a mask, over meals, right? Meet at the parks, be in community with each other. Like, to me, it really is about just getting to the basics of interacting with other humans and trying to understand each other's issues, understand each other's worldviews, and discuss together what are the ways that we can participate in our local democracy. I do believe it starts locally, and that's why I'm encouraging folks to create spaces where you are communing over common things like food or a TV show, and then y'all get into the issues and y'all talk through it and get involved.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. AJ.
Yeah, I think there's often, when folks are newly engaging in any type of movement work, there's intimidation, but I just want to reiterate that participatory to me means that every person is involved and valued and has a voice. And so that means you can consult, you can dissent, you can approve, you can struggle with your fellow folks, and you can contribute in a compelling way. From an organizing standpoint, I think one of the biggest things for me is just being in deep and active listening. And I did want to kind of touch on one of the questions we ain't really get to, but which was like, how would I recreate a democracy? And that to me begs this question of like, rather than recreating a democracy, what kind of social structures do we want to create where the power is horizontal, where we can learn from indigenous social structures, where people understood not only the sacredness of every being, but we were in right relationship with the land as stewards and not possessors, where spirit is principal to everyday life as much as the material world, where whiteness is not the sociogenic force as described by Fanon, that institutes the consensus reality for Black and Brown folks, and where radical care is centered. And again, I think we can learn a lot from mutual aid projects that happen. Yeah, those are some of my thoughts on a functional social structure that doesn't necessarily need to be a democracy. I think we can think more creatively.
Appreciate that. Last but not least, Rukia.
Yeah, I'll be quick and think creatively about how people can engage. Everybody doesn't have to be there in person. Everybody doesn't have to be on the Zoom, but share a survey, get a conversation going, canvas door to door with your mask on, talk to folks. Engagement can look different in various ways. And I think that's all I have to say, other than, I mean, I really appreciate Zelda's comments and presentation. One thing, we have a partnership with Comrades in South Africa, and I've gone and studied their assemblies. And I think it's really important that we look at this assembly process as not just helping our local, hyper-local work, but also how do we connect to the global struggle that our people are going through around building democracy.
Listen, thank you all for an amazing, amazing presentation. It was on fire. Like, I don't know who was the Kojic versus the AME person versus the Baptist, but y'all all preached a sermon tonight. So thank y'all so much. And kick it over to Cameron to close us out.
Thank y'all. Just quickly, just gonna give a quick summary of the people's process that you see on your screen. This is where we're headed next. We want to catalyze a national movement. We're trying to repeal and replace the 94 crime bill, right? And so basically what all of this lovely slide is saying is we want to democratize that process, similar to what you already heard tonight, right? Making sure people are involved and making sure we come up with solutions that keep us safe outside of the carceral state. Next slide. So if you want to get plugged in, here's how you can. Go to our website, follow us on social media. And you can also sign up at bit.ly.pp/interest. And we'll also share all this out in our follow-up email after tonight. And I'm going to launch a really quick poll. So if you have time, please, please, please share your feedback with us so we can know how we did and how we can improve. And again, thank you to our panelists and to our moderator and to our host and to everybody behind the scenes who helped out. And thank you to all of you for spending time with us tonight to learn more about this. We'll let the poll stay up for a minute and then we'll close it at 8:30.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Cameron, etc. So yeah, I'll be heading off to bed. Cheers. Bye. Thank you. Okay.
All right, thanks again for y'all's feedback and for sharing the poll. We'll also share some more ways to give feedback in our follow-up email. Please stay safe and take care.